Welcome to the Dare to Multiply podcast. On this podcast, we help passionate Jesus followers become courageous, obedient disciples who impact their communities for the kingdom of God. I'm your host, Cynthia Anderson, a disciple multiplication coach and trainer. I'm going to show you how to make and multiply disciples in your area. God's got great things ahead for you. Let's dare to multiply. We want to see people become disciples who make disciples, who multiply disciples and disciple-making groups, house churches, micro churches. But what does that pathway look like? Where we start with someone who is just a new connection and we move them through a process, a pathway to becoming someone who makes and multiplies disciples. Well, today we have a real treat on the Dare to Multiply podcast. We're talking with Matt Ulrich. He's from Gainesville, Florida, from the Greenhouse Church, and he is the microchurch pastor there. He's going to be sharing with us about what that pathway looks like, how to develop these pathways in your church or in your movement so that people can move along it smoothly to the point where they become disciples who make disciples and are starting new groups themselves. Matt has so much to share. We'll talk about marriage and family and lots of other great things today. So we'll be right back with that in just a moment. Are you busy but not seeing the fruit you long for? Dissatisfied with your present level of impact on those around you? Or frustrated with traditional methods of discipleship that don't seem to be effective? If so, the Getting Started in Disciple-Making Movements course may be just what you need. Inside the Getting Started program, you'll get access to a step-by-step proven approach to making and multiplying disciples. Not only will you receive 25 short and practical video teachings spread out over 6 modules, but you'll have a chance to connect with others for group coaching via our monthly Zoom calls. And even more importantly, you'll become part of a global community of like-minded people from all over the world who are passionately committed to following Jesus and impacting others around them. If you want to get unstuck and begin moving forward as a disciple who makes disciples, I encourage you to go to courses.dmmsfrontiermissions.com and sign up for this powerful program today. And now to today's episode. Well, I am here today in this podcast episode with Matt Ulrich. I'm not sure, did I pronounce that right, Matt?
You got it. Nailed it.
Awesome. And he is from Florida. He is a staff member of, he's the microchurch pastor of a church there called Greenhouse Church. And I met him recently at a conference, and I just thought, this guy has something that these people who are listening to the Dare to Multiply podcast need to hear. Matt, I'm kind of new to the microchurch world, to be honest. We do a lot with disciple-making movements, and there's so much overlap. Yeah. But the Dare to Multiply podcast is really focused on anyone who wants to multiply disciples. No matter what stream of, thinking you're in, we just want to help people dare to multiply disciples, not just add them. And so I'm really grateful that you're here today. Looking forward to hearing more about your journey. So why don't we start off with that? I'm sure I butchered your introduction, so tell us a little bit more about yourself. Yeah. And how did you get started in this microchurch disciple multiplication path?
Yeah, so I didn't come from a Christian home, so I was the first in my family to start following Jesus when I was about 17 years old. I had absolutely no church background, no biblical worldview. So when I started reading the Bible, I just kind of took it for face value. And I just was looking around and I'm like, wait, I was surprised and confused that so many churches, including the one that I was attending at the time, they just weren't doing what Jesus's final words were, to go and make disciples. And not to say that churches weren't. I just wasn't encountering any in my little sphere of influence. And so, I don't know, I just kind of got fixated on that idea that if this is the final words, these are the final words of Jesus, they probably are pretty important, right? Mm-hmm. So for the past, 18 years, I've really just kind of dedicated my life to figuring this out and trying to make disciples. So I've been at Greenhouse for 18 years. 18 years. I've been on staff for 16 years. And I've been leading micro churches for 18 years. One of my passions is training and raising up other disciple makers and micro church leaders. So, I mean, I went to UF, much to my dad's chagrin. He's a medical doctor, and I was a
What's
pre-med.
UF for some people who may not know?
University of Florida, the University of Florida.
Okay.
So I was following in my dad's footsteps. I was a pre-med, and I just, I had just gotten saved. And so the analytical side of my brain was like, I've got to figure this out. And so I switched to a world religions major, which he was pretty excited about, but just to figure it out. And so was really kind of pursuing faith in that sense. Obviously, I still believe in Jesus very fully and in all full orthodoxy, but really just set me on a journey of trying to figure out who he is and what he called us to do. So I went to Fuller Seminary. I was a Master's of Divinity student. I went to India for a missions trip and became an MDiv dropout. I was like, how is Greek and Hebrew going to help these children?
Where'd you go, by the way?
I deferred to the School of Intercultural Studies is what it was called at the time. So I got
okay. But I mean in India, since I lived there 14 years. Yeah.
Rajasthan.
Rajasthan. Okay. Very cool.
And so that was that was my first time out of the country, life altering moment for me. So that really just kind of upped the ante of, man, we've got to be making disciples who make disciples that are going to reach the nations. And so, yeah, Greenhouse has been an incubator for me. And like I said, I've almost been here for 2 decades. So my last 2 decades of life has been a functional laboratory of disciple making, tinkering, failing, succeeding, learning about all things related to discipleship and how we integrate that to microchurches.
Wow, that's wonderful. I loved what you said about as a new believer, it just, you're like taking scripture at face value. And I've seen that so frequently, as we've worked in India and Thailand and abroad, how people read the Bible and they're like, oh, Jesus said to pray for the sick or heal the sick. Okay, I should go do that, And some of us who've been in the church for a long time, we've had lots of conditioning not to actually do what the Bible says. But I love that part of your story. And that's why we need to focus on new believers, right? They are often much more obedient naturally.
Correct. Right.
Oh, that's great. Well, I also noticed you have a heart for marriages. We'll talk about that a little bit later. You're the author of, is it 6 books? Did I get that right?
I think so.
You think so? I love that. We sometimes forget. I'm sure I've only got 2 under my belt, so it's easier to remember. But you're an author. You've done so much in the kingdom, and we're so grateful for that. But tell us a little bit more about the main topic that we wanted to talk about today, which is the idea of developing a discipleship pathway.
Yeah, I'm just more convinced than ever that, and I'm preaching to the choir if you're listening to this podcast, that discipleship's absolutely vital for any microchurch or multiply movement to thrive. The key, like, there's so many Christians who want to be faithful to the call to make disciples. They just don't know what that means or what that even looks like. And so, I mean, have you ever tried to sum up what a disciple is in one sentence? I mean, I literally did a doctoral dissertation on disciple making. It took me months to come up with a 1-sentence definition, and I'm sure that's still radically insufficient. I mean, but so many Christians, I feel like, are paralyzed because they know Jesus is imperative to go make disciples. They know that it's important. They just don't know what they're doing or where they're going or even what it takes to get there, which is why I really do believe we have to have a discipleship pathway for them to follow. But what churches...
Let me interrupt you right there. I want to hear your 1-sentence definition before we pass over that. So, if you have it memorized.
I for sure do. A fully committed follower of Jesus who's learning, living, and reproducing his ways. So it's kind of a
fully committed follower of Jesus who's...
learning,
say it one more time.
Learning, living, and reproducing his ways.
Learning, living, and reproducing.
Yeah. So it kind of incorporates, like, hey, disciples should be disciple makers. Those 2 things shouldn't be bifurcated. They shouldn't be 2 different categories. And we'll get into the pathway stuff. In some levels, it's just like, I think all believers should be disciples, but I don't think all believers are disciples. So we'll get into that, but I'm
Yeah,
trying to.
sure. Sorry to interrupt you there,
No,
but I didn't want to miss that gem that I knew was there. If you worked on it that hard for that long, I wanted to know what it was. So
it feels so silly because it sounds so elementary, but you spend some, but it's hard to really encompass all of those things into just what Jesus says into one sentence. Almost an
it
impossible.
is. Absolutely. You've done well. I like your definition.
Thank you.
That's great.
But I think a lot of people want to, but what we do as churches is that we overcorrect to either a hyper structured, uncontextualized, one size fits all discipleship model, or we go the other way and we throw the baby out with the bathwater and just tell people, hey, be salt and light by making your community better. But there's not any actionable steps and sometimes even negative reactions to fulfilling the Great Commission, preaching the gospel, leading people to a saving faith in Jesus, baptizing them, raising them up to do everything that Jesus has taught them to obey. So we don't want on one side just to be another set of humanistic good people, but we also simply can't take what somebody else is doing successfully in one context and try to force fit that into our context. So for me,
true.
a discipleship pathway, it's a breathable model that allows people to catch the vision of what Jesus called them to do, while at the same time allowing for the flexibility to do that in a way that Jesus is calling them to do. So there is a tension of finding that balance for your people and your context, but I think it's important because Jesus rarely ever gives us rules to follow or does things the same way every time. I mean, we were talking about healing. Like, look at the way people or Jesus healed people. Sometimes it was with a word. Sometimes he spit in mud and put it on somebody's face. Sometimes the person wasn't even like within miles of him. He just said it, and the centurion's servant was healed. I mean, so he every time was different because he was listening to the Father and asking him how it should look. And so, but what Jesus does is he shows us a life of abiding and a way that is led by the voice of God. But he also has key principles that lead and guide us. And so I think having a discipleship pathway should help people learn, live, and reproduce the ways of Jesus without constricting them to an unmovable or unmalleable model of doing so.
So a simple pathway that has some principles that are pretty much the same for everybody, but also flexibility within it for the leading of the Holy Spirit. And yeah, that's so important. You know, I think we as Americans can be very addicted to flexibility. And we just, you know, and then both you and I come from a Pentecostal background, so you know we even more want, you know, let the Holy Spirit lead. We don't want to have any kind of, you know, sometimes not everybody, but you know that pathway I think is really important for the reproducibility. And yet I really appreciate what you say about it needs to be flexible. So tell us a little bit more. What's that pathway look like for you, or what would you recommend for people?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of going back to our thing, like what does Jesus say? I think that the pathway should begin where Jesus told us to begin it, and he said, "Go and make disciples." And so I think that's the case. And in this case, I think that word "go," and this is the beauty of. I just think Jesus is super smart. You know, I think that he's
Me too. I'm on board with that.
We say a lot, oh, he's holy, he's righteous. I think he's brilliant, and this is one of Dallas Willard's things: is he's the smartest man alive. But I think that word "go," I mean, because if you get in the weeds of theologians, some people say that word means go as in go somewhere else, like pantata ethne, like go to the nations, while others will have the connotation of it means, well, while you're going, you should make disciples. And I really just believe that Jesus knows that we can do both, you know, so I believe a good pathway should begin with advice that any good missionary will tell someone who has aspirations to go to the mission field is do what you are planning to do on the mission field where you are right now. So while you are going, make disciples. So while you're living your everyday life, make disciples. And I think that has to begin with the baptizing and teaching imperatives of the Great Commission, which is two sides of the discipleship coin. We should not, in my mind, I don't think we should separate those into two distinct categories, because then what we do is we start outsourcing aspects of disciple making to some people while others cop out, claiming, oh, I'm not an evangelist, I'm not going to share the gospel. Oh, I'm not a teacher, I'm going to leave that to somebody else. Evangelists will prioritize soul winning. Shepherd teachers want to teach already saved folks, but healthy pathways, I think, align with the Great Commission and will call all believers to do both.
Yeah, let me just put a pin in what you said there, so people make sure they catch it. We do have a few people who listen who are second language English speakers, and I know you're speaking a little rapidly, so I want to make sure to slow you down and make sure people are catching. But you said that evangelism and discipleship shouldn't be seen as two separate things, but they should be merged in the pathway. Did I hear you right?
Yes, yes, you did. I think that
Yeah.
that's a very important piece is that we people will have abilities and giftings, right? We're big on the APES, the apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, teachers.
We
But
just
just
had Neil Cole on here talking about that. So, yeah.
so that's one of those things I've just heard people say, well, I'm not an evangelist. I'm like, well, Jesus didn't say evangelists go make disciples. He said, if you're following me, go make disciples. So I think that we have to make sure that we've got both of those aspects of the Great Commission fully ingrained in every believer's life, not just people who are naturally or even supernaturally good at that. It's something that we all are called to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, talk us through sort of the stages. You've got go.
Yep. So I think honestly, like those are kind of the big umbrella pieces. When we break it down into just kind of the pathway, we have kind of 6 stages of the pathway that we use. And it just goes, I'll say all 6 and then I'll break each one down. It starts with a new connection and it moves to interested, believer, disciple, disciple maker, and then a multiplier. And so a new connection, it really is just any person that you meet. It could literally be anyone that you know that does not know Jesus yet. This could be coworkers, this could be a waitress, a neighbor, whoever's in your sphere of influence. And this really does level the playing ground to literally anyone on earth that does not know Jesus could be a potential new connection. And I know in America, we find that a lot of Christians don't have a lot of non-Christian connections.
Yeah,
And
I think that's true in many countries. Yeah.
and so if that's the case, we need to start looking in our spheres of influence. Everybody has neighbors. Some people might, if you're in certain country, might go to the gym, go to restaurants, go to the market. For example, I love this specific restaurant in Gainesville. I just go there as much as possible, partly because I do love the food there, but partly because I work at a church. So my circles with non-believers, like I don't have a work circle that I can go to. Hopefully, I'm not praying for my coworkers to get saved if they're working. uh, but at the restaurant, I go there because I like the food, but I also go there because I want to find new connections. And so at the restaurant, I know every server by name. I know the owner. She asks about my kids. One of the waitresses literally yesterday was telling me about her dog having bowel issues. I know
You've gotten pretty intimate there.
we've got some intimate. I had another waitress who I gave her my wife's number because her sister-in-law's daughter has spina bifida. They just had a baby, and my oldest daughter has spina bifida. So I'm just constantly fishing for any new connections I have wherever I go. And so I think that's a big thing because our next step is then to just build a relationship and have intentional conversations. I want to be their friend, someone they genuinely trust. And then once we kind of have that rapport, I'll start going into the next phase of the pathway for us, which is finding out if someone is interested in pursuing spiritual matters. And so, I'll ask them, just gauge their beliefs, ask if I can pray for them, see kind of like if there's any interest there, invite them to church or a micro church. If I can get to the point of sharing the gospel, like we're trying to see from a new connection to, are they interested in spirituality? And you see Jesus do this. He'll say, hey, come follow me. And some people do. And when people don't, he doesn't beg and plead and he doesn't run after them. He just says, okay. Like I think that there are seasons where we sow seeds and sometimes the soil is rocky. Doesn't mean it's always going to be rocky, but I'm going to find those new connections, engage. And if someone shows interest, I'm going to continue to pursue that relationship even more and continue on this pathway. And
Right.
so if somebody is interested, we have those conversations. And at that point, this is kind of where we're getting to the point of salvation, where at that point, we're going to share the gospel or get them into gospel environments where they're hearing the word, they're hearing the gospel. And hopefully at that point, the next step of the pathway is the third is becoming a believer, someone who has a saving faith in Jesus. And I know in my context in Florida and America in the Bible Belt, although we're a little below the belt, we're still close enough where a lot of people will say they love and follow Jesus, but it's just cultural. So we're trying to get them to a place of a saving faith. And then once somebody's there, the next step for them, we want to get them into a discipleship or a microchurch community.
Where would baptism happen? Would it happen there?
Yes, yeah, that would
Okay.
be that move to believer would be that place of baptizing and then to teach. We've got a little
Right.
diagram I could maybe share with in the resources afterwards that has the 6 pieces, and then underneath it has baptize and has teach underneath as well. So,
Sure.
so yeah, it kind of gives a little bit of this is the progression on the evangelistic side and then on the teaching side as well. But then, we want to get those believers. We don't want them, like I said before, should all believers be disciples? They should, in my mind. Are all believers disciples? I would say probably not. But a disciple for us, it's just somebody, again, who's learning, living, and then reproducing those ways. So we want to get them in communities where they're having someone take them under their wing and be discipled. And so their next step is to find that discipleship relationship. At our church, we have kind of a formal training called discipleship training, pretty straightforward. We're trying to help people become confident and equipped as disciples and disciple makers. So we have them move from a disciple to, okay, now you're learning and living, now start reproducing. So we want them to become not just a disciple, but a disciple maker. And so their next step, obviously, is to make disciples. A lot of people's pathways that I've seen they end here though, but there is an intentionality to call someone to not just make disciples, but to reproduce disciple makers. And I know that
Mm.
that's your heart and your passion as well. And this is a critical final step that we need to
Mm.
repeat often, so that the culture itself can help people move along the pathway. So for us, it's again, a new connection, interested, believer, disciple, disciple maker. And then the final move is to become a multiplier, someone who is not just raising up disciples, but they're releasing disciple makers.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, you want a pathway that anyone in your microchurch or movement can grab, understand, and follow, especially in some of those places that you're talking about where literacy might not be as prevalent. We need to make this easy enough to translate into action without having a huge booklet that somebody has to go through. I mean, I literally use this with my kids, my 7 and 12-year-old daughters. They're on this pathway. I'm also training them to use this pathway. So we just want it to be as insanely easy and reproducible with clear next steps so that anybody can pick it up and run with it.
So important. We do in America, especially I think in the West, we overcomplicate discipleship.
100%.
And I feel like I have to reduce it back, simplify again, simplify again. It's
Yeah.
this constant process of checking. I love what you said about your kids. Can a 7-year-old do this? If
Right.
not, I need to look at it again, because 7-year-olds are good disciple makers. If
They
you can
are.
show them what it's all about, they are on it.
Absolutely.
So we want to empower everyone to be disciple makers and multipliers. And for those of you who've read my content and stuff, part of what he's talking about with the disciple maker and multiplier, those are what we sometimes call the green and blue people. And those are who you're going to want to invest in more, because they're going to multiply and see the movement grow. So good. Well, tell us a story about someone who's kind of walked this journey, if you would, Matt. What's it look like in real life for a person to go through this?
Sure. I'll give you the all-star version and then a maybe real-time version. The all-star is we had a woman in our church. She was in her early 20s. Her name's Carrie. She was working at the YMCA, and she had a coworker there. And again, it was a new connection. So she started working with this woman named Brooke, started to build relationship with her, started to establish a friendship, got to the point where she was starting to move into those spiritual conversations, into that interested category, because she had built enough rapport where Brooke would be open to listen, because she saw something different in Carrie in the way that she worked and the way that she lived her life. And so there was gospel proclamation there. At that point, Brooke did start following Jesus. So that was when she became a believer piece of the pathway. And she ended up coming to what we call our macro church service, our Sunday gathering initially. She got plugged into a microchurch. And in there was where that discipleship, the move from believer to disciple, really started to happen in her life. She was actually in my microchurch for a couple years. So we just helped raise her up. I'm definitely not going to take all the credit for Brooke, because there's many people in that process, but she was in my wife and my microchurch. We raised her up. She multiplied out and started leading one of her own microchurches after going through the discipleship training. Was just crushing it. I mean, killing it as a disciple maker. We asked her to do an internship because she was
What's
just.
that mean for somebody? What's it mean to crush it as a disciple maker? Tell us what that means.
Yes, it means that she really just was embodying this. She would bring, especially other women, close to her life, and they were coming to know the Lord. They were coming to not just attend church, they started to become disciples themselves and really embody this and own this and really start
Awesome.
even making disciples. The people Brooke was raising up were making disciples of their own as well at this point. So she had already kind of moved into that multiplier stage, and she has since become one of the pastors at our church. She's the youth pastor, and it's just amazing to watch her take discipleship and embody that in, like, my oldest daughter's in 6th grade, so she's going through this process, and I see just discipleship happening. So they have leaders that disciple each of the grades, and it's an amazing framework that they have where my 6th grader is learning how to be a disciple and is going to have opportunities to make disciples herself. It's just been
beautiful, and the way it should be. I mean, I think that's what Jesus intended.
Yeah.
That's so
And I
cool.
mean, like, one that's kind of real time is my neighbor. So Pat, his name's Pat, and just moved down from New Jersey a few years ago. Very far from the Lord. He would have probably said he was a cultural Catholic, but there's no saving faith there at all. It was just kind of, this is who my family is. But he was a new connection, obviously a new neighbor. It was during COVID, at the beginning of COVID, when nobody really knew what was going on. So we would have what we called family dinners outdoors. We just put a white plastic table in between our houses, and I'd say, hey man, we'll make some spaghetti. You come over, bring your family, and more families can eat together. So we started that new connection. Really started to just see if they were interested in spiritual things. He was a lot more aloof and kind of guarded. His wife, Bree, was a lot more open. And so we had lots of conversations with her. She ended up becoming a believer, like having that saving faith, becoming a believer in Jesus, getting baptized. And Patrick was a little farther back. He did find out that I was a pastor, so that knocked me
Kind of
back.
knocked him back for a while.
There was a couple months where he was not really wanting anything.
Scared to death of you, I bet.
Exactly. Somebody blew my cover. I said, why would you tell me? But he ended up again really starting to lean in, and he would come and ask me questions on his own time. He'd be like, Matt, I've got a question. What about the Bible? I mean, is it so many people? And so we would have these conversations about just faith and spirituality. And anytime that he was ready, I would talk to him. And so he's now kind of in that believer category as well. And so we're trying to help them find a microchurch where they feel comfortable and confident. So even that's just kind of a in progress right now, where my next step for both of them is, let's help them become disciples so
Right.
that they then have something to reproduce and make disciples themselves.
Yeah.
And it's just,
those are beautiful stories. I'm sure you have so many more that you could tell, but I think it helps us sort of put into that framework when we're talking about real people. So thanks for sharing those. Yeah. Well, for some people who are listening, they hear me talk about disciple making movements, church planting movements all the time. But this term microchurch is something maybe brand new to them. So tell us a little bit, what is a microchurch? How is it different from a house church, or the same? And just unpack that for us a little.
Yeah. So most people, at least in the American context, will say, they hear microchurch and say, oh, that's like small groups, right? And my answer is unequivocally no. It's not. They're not like your small groups. I think the main differentiation is that we believe microchurches are the church. And so I think that's the most significant demarcation between microchurches and small groups, is that we believe that microchurch is a full expression of church. And we see this in just early New Testament ecclesiology. It wasn't defined by a structure, but more by the assembling and gathering of God's people. And I won't go too deep into that, but there's some scriptures and things that show, like, hey, church isn't just represented by a time of the week or a place. It's really just, it's a local group of believers of any particular size and structure gathering in the name of Jesus. But it also doesn't mean that just because if you're hanging out with your 3 Christian friends at a coffee shop, that's church either. So the New Testament church gathered with purpose and strategic intent of fulfilling the Great Commandment and the Great Commission. And so Jesus said, like everything kind of flows out of these foundational imperatives. So we're loving God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. We're loving our neighbor as ourselves. The Great Commission gives us that missional call to make disciples. So for us, we really feel like the ecclesial minimum, if you will, like what we think makes up church is this combination of a community of believers that are worshiping God, they're on mission together, and they're in community. And so we see that all over especially the book of Acts. So we think church, whether there's 4 people or 4,000 people in the room, the church is active, alive, and healthy if these 3 components are in play. And so even with that, I do think that there are Sunday gatherings in church buildings in America that are not church. I think that there are gatherings in people's homes that are church. Micro churches, we have micro churches that meet in living rooms, downtown, in the streets, at detention centers. We had one that met in the dressing rooms of a strip club because there are 4 women who felt very called to reach women vulnerable to prostitution. So for us, size doesn't matter; the content and expression does. So I think a house church really could be very similar to a microchurch in that sense. If worship, mission, and community are happening, I think that that's a really big piece of what we would delineate as church. So we kind of have a micro macro expression. We can have a both and expression, but yeah, I don't know how far into the weeds we want to get on that, but that's kind of a general understanding of the micro church.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So, gathering, worshiping in community, and on mission for Jesus. Did I get that?
Yeah, just I mean the succinct way is just worship, mission, and community. Those 3 elements.
Worship, mission, and community. Yeah, so good. I have an ebook called What Makes a Church on my website as well. And I think we're very much in alignment there in our ecclesiology, the study of the church. Probably we both went to the same schools and have studied the same scriptures. But yeah, so good. So it doesn't have to have a building. It doesn't have to have a pastor. And so interesting, Matt, that you would even go so far as to say some churches that gather on Sunday or some groups that gather on Sunday in a big building maybe aren't even fully expressing the church in that way.
Yeah, I mean, if there's no gospel proclamation, if there aren't people coming to faith, then like I think it's a tough call to make, and I say this humbly, but I would argue I don't know if that is the full expression of church.
Yeah, so important. Yeah, not that we're criticizing those groups, but calling them to something more. So yeah, so good. Well, our time is flying by here. Tell us a little bit. I noticed your passion is for marriages. I know we don't have time to do a whole podcast on that, but speak to that just a little bit. Why is that so important to you, and how does that relate to those who are really engaging in apostolic ministry? We have a lot of people who listen to this who are movement leaders and those that are going after movement. Why is it so important?
Yeah, I will try to succinctly say that.
I know I asked you a hard task there. Sorry about that.
I think marriage is the ultimate missional relationship. I don't think it's a social contract. It's a sacred covenant that reflects the deep, unconditional love of Christ and his church. I think if a couple has children, that is the ultimate of discipleship relationships, whereas parents, we're literally shaping the worldview of these tiny humans that you have been given spiritual jurisdiction over. We have tens of thousands of hours with these children to raise up strong and confident disciple makers that you can take on this discipleship journey and pathway deeper than any other person in the world. And all the while, these kids ideally have a front row seat to a marriage that reflects the goodness, the love, and the grace of our Savior. I've always said that I want my marriage to be the ultimate altar call for my girls. If my girls knew nothing about Jesus Christ, literally nothing about him or the gospel, but if someone simply said to them, "This man Jesus loves you the way that your dad loves your mom," I would want them to say, "Then I want to follow him with everything that I have." I think marriages should be the bedrock of our gospel proclamation because it takes so much gospel work to actually reflect the goodness of Jesus and the beauty of his bride in the context of marriage. But when a marriage is working right, it should be the bastion and beacon of gospel light that draws unbelievers and believers to the flame of the Spirit. It should be our living testimony of the glory of God, in which we could take people under our wing, disciple our children, and maybe those who did not have strong disciple making parents, that we can then disciple and then release, who will then disciple and release. I mean, my wife and I have probably had about 20 people live in our home over the past 18 years. When I was in seminary, a family let me live in their home, and it was the first time I had ever seen a functioning Christian family. My parents were divorced when I was 11. They weren't following Jesus before or after that. So it was deeply impactful. So I've become a reproducer of that. And so there have been some of those times were just a few days. Others, people would stay for 2 years. Some of them were immigrant children from detention centers between Mexico and the United States. Some were foster kids. But with every interaction, we did our best to pour out and embody gospel love and grace so that they were marked that Jesus is a Lord worthy of following, and his way is the best way to live. So our home and radical hospitality combined with our marriages should be a guiding light for disciple making, that who can then replicate that hospitality and that fierce love for others as we guide more people along a discipleship pathway. And I think that a strong marriage can be a catalytic relationship for releasing disciple makers and releasing just the hospitality and the multiplicative nature of the kingdom.
So important. And, I think there are so many of us, and, we're passionate about making disciples. We have an urgency about reaching the lost. And sometimes our families can get kind of lost in the midst of that, and it's such an important reminder, I think, for anyone who's passionate about reaching the lost, that it's not that I don't really believe, I don't know how you feel about this, Matt, but it's that it's God, your family, and then others. I'm not into this sort of process there, but I think it just flows out together. It's God, your family, and others, and they all go together. Yeah. And yet, without a strong family, it really does impact our witness and our ability to disciple. And yet, it's a real discipline to make time for that in the midst of this burning passion for the lost. Maybe talk about that just for a minute. How do you personally make sure that your family gets the time that they need?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there are just healthy rhythms. I'm a big advocate. I don't think it's a law per se, but I'm a big, I think there's just spiritual and biblical wisdom to the Sabbath. I think that there's something to just taking a day of rest. And so that's a day where I am with my family. I'm unplugged from technology, and I'm just giving them my undivided attention. So we say in my home that the rules of Sabbath are it's rest, worship, and play. Those are the three things that we do. And so we worship together, we play together, we rest together. And those are some of the best days of our week as a family. And I also think, just as a good, healthy disciple maker, you bring people along with the things you're already doing. So when I'm going and inviting people to church or witnessing or doing something, my kids are with me. When we're making disciples in the home, my kids are with me. When we're fostering and we're doing kingdom work, we ask our children, hey, this is a family discipleship moment. Are you in? Are you going to invest? So for us, my family is not separated from my disciple making or any type of multiplication. They are, like you said, I agree. I don't think that it's this like 1, 2, 3. I think there are concentric circles that kind of blend and bleed into things. And I think a healthy disciple maker will have the intentional and strategic foresight to bring family, to bring your husband or wife, and to bring your children along with you. I think like you said, some of the greatest little disciple makers are preteens. My 12-year-old is a better evangelist than I am. I mean, there's just a beauty to it that when we do it together, we're just going to be better. So it's bringing them along, like you said, it's not compartmentalized. Like everything is the Lord's. And if we're intentionally multiplying, man, this is your best shot to leave a generational legacy of a multiplier that you just can bring. And so they do everything with me. So
yeah, well, that's another thing we have in common. My children are all grown and married, and we have grandkids now, but we took our kids everywhere with us. They went into the slums. We ministered together. They helped with medical camps. We had people live with us, widows, a widow who had a broken hip, and a baby that we were rehabilitating. And they were so much a part of everything we did.
And then it becomes normative. that becomes normative Christianity. It's, hey,
Yeah.
we bring in the foreigner, we love the marginalized, we share the gospel. And if it's one thing if we just say it, like you said, the Western world, we just keep it here. I think Jesus wants us to have practical, actionable steps with our faith. So if we can show that to them at a young age, then that will become normative walking with Jesus for them when they get older.
Yeah, that's right. And we've seen that to be true with our kids as they've grown up. A lot of those things are just kind of normal DNA. You know, our daughter went to college at the University of Minnesota in Duluth, and all of a sudden she was starting groups of disciples, and they became disciple makers. And I said, Stephanie, do you know what you're doing? That's exactly what mom teaches. She's like, oh, really? You know, it's just
That's
part of who
awesome.
she was
That's a
because
great
she'd seen it
testimony.
modeled all her life, you know, and it was normal.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so good. Well, Matt, it has been a real privilege to talk with you today. I feel like we have so much in common. We're going to have to get together for a meal sometime whenever we're near Florida, or you're in Thailand, which is where I normally live. You're most welcome. Look me up and my husband. But yeah, thank you so much for being with us. We want to know about your resources, the books you've written. How do people connect with those? What's the best place for them to go?
Probably Amazon. So they're on Amazon.com, the books. And if anybody wants any resources, just real quickly, I remember when I first started ministry, I didn't know what I was doing. And so my first day, my boss said, hey, you'll figure it out. So I went to Bethany World Prayer Center, and their head of cell groups spent the whole day with me. I'm just
Wow.
this punk 26-year-old kid, and just spent all this time. And I said, hey, he gave me all these resources, and I said, how much did they cost? And he looked at me like I was crazy and said, son, are you doing this for the kingdom? I said, oh, yes, sir. He said, then just take it. And so for that really marked me. So, I mean, if there are any resources, you know, if there's discipleship training or anything that I've talked about that anybody wants, if they want to just email me, I mean, I'm sure we can kind of put that somewhere where that's visible. But yeah, I would love to just chat or talk or send any resources that could be helpful, because we're all on the same team. We're all making disciples for the same Lord. And so if there's something that we can give, we would love to give it.
Oh, thank you so much. So generous of you. And you mentioned there's a couple of books that are especially relevant. You want to give us the titles of those?
Yeah, so Microchurch Leader Essentials is one that is kind of talking about discipleship in the microchurch context. So that's kind of one of our training manuals that we use here at Greenhouse. Get in the Boat is another one that's kind of just taking everyday discipleship and making that just contextualized to your context. So it's kind of like, do you remember Mad Libs when we were little? You had to fill in the words. Said, we have kind of an appendix in the back of that one that's kind of like a discipleship Mad Libs, where it's just you're reading and then you're putting it into this appendix. So at the end of the book, you'll have a full kind of discipleship model that you can kind of just real time apply to the people and the contexts and spheres of your life. So I think those two are the ones that would probably be most pertinent to our conversations today.
That's great. Well, we will put the links for those in the show notes of this. And yeah, any last words of encouragement? There's a lot of people listening who are just beginning on this journey. What would you say to encourage them?
Yeah, I would say just focus on who's in front of you. Ask the Lord for open doors, follow a pathway of sorts, make disciples. I think a lot of people lose their way because they don't know what they're doing. I think you said it, we make it complex and challenging. Jesus didn't do that. He simply wants us to just preach the gospel, lead people to faith, teach them to do what Jesus said. So even just grabbing a handful of tools, something like, the 3 circles, 15-second testimony, discovery Bible studies, just go for it. Because there is nothing in this world that will ignite your passion, give you a sense of fulfillment, and make you come more alive than fulfilling the Great Commission. Money is not going to do that. Relationships and kids is not going to do that. Success is not going to do that, because they were never meant to. Right? We were made in the image of a missional God of redemption. So when your heart starts beating in alignment with his, you will come alive, because that's what you were made to do. And so I just say, hey, there's one thing we can't do in heaven. We can't win souls in heaven. Let's do as much as we can here on earth and really just reap those eternal benefits by watching people come to Christ. And And it really is. There's nothing like it. So I just encourage everyone to just go for it, fail forward, and just really enjoy being a co-laborer with Jesus.
Amen. That's so beautiful. Thanks, Matt. Great to have you. And we'll do a quick wrap up here in just a moment with a recap of some of the things that Matt has shared. But God bless you guys. And thanks, Matt, again for being with us.
Thank you, Cynthia.
Imagine a world where passionate followers of Jesus come together to multiply, transforming lives beyond imagination. Instead of toiling with little fruit, what if God's abundance flowed beyond your wildest dreams? Picture those you've invested in sharing Jesus freely, creating a ripple effect of disciple making. In her new book, The Multiplier's Mindset, Cynthia Anderson reveals how shifting mindsets can revolutionize disciple making. When Cynthia and her colleagues experienced these mindset shifts, they saw enormous results, including the launching of 19 multiplying movements in Africa and Asia, transforming tens of thousands of lives. This book will help you discover hidden harvesters, see church members move from passivity to passion, and release the power of simplicity in multiplying disciples. Don't remain stuck. Learn to move toward greater fruitfulness. Visit multipliersmindset.com and get your copy of The Multiplier's Mindset today.
All right. Wow. What a wonderful interview and so many takeaways that are there. Some that really stood out to me was a disciple is a fully committed follower of Jesus who is learning, living, and reproducing the life of Jesus, right? Those three things are all really important. We need to continually be learning, living it out, and reproducing discipleship, reproducing his way with others. He talked about the pathway of discipleship being simple and flexible. And he just to review that, he started with new connection. When we make a new connection with someone, we then find out if they're interested through spiritual conversations. They then become a believer, put their faith and trust in Jesus, take baptism. Then they become a disciple. We're discipling them in how to follow Jesus and training them how to multiply and make other disciples. And then, Lord willing, they become a multiplier who is also training others to do the same. This is a simple pathway that anyone can follow. We talked about the definition of church a bit, how micro churches are not the same as a small group or a life group, but they're a full expression of church. And he defined church as worship, mission, and community. If those three things are present, it is a church, right? We talked about how not every gathering on Sunday morning is actually a biblical church in the sense of having those three things in it. And so we want to challenge and encourage you, if you are part of a church, ask yourself that question. Does my church include worship? How are we doing on mission? How are we doing on community, true, open, vulnerable community? Are those three things present in the churches that I'm a part of or that I'm beginning? And then I was so glad to get some gems on marriage. As you know, I am such a believer in the importance of emotionally healthy spirituality. Pete Scazzero's work on that, and how out of our healthy marriage and family flows the disciple making ministry of our lives. And Matt said, I want my marriage to be the ultimate altar call. That if all my children see or all anyone sees is my marriage, it would be enough to make them want to follow Jesus. I love that. Is your marriage and your family an altar call to people around you? Do they see so much of Jesus in the life of your marriage that they want to follow Jesus? Boy, that is a challenge to me afresh. I want my marriage to be an altar call, like Matt talked about. And then he talked about some healthy practices like Sabbath, putting away your phone, spending time resting and worshiping and praying with your family, and playing, sorry, not just praying, but also playing with your family at least one day a week, where you stop the busyness of work and ministry and you take time to rest. and practice Sabbath. So good. I hope you'll grab some of Matt's resources and books, and God bless you guys. Keep making and multiplying disciples. Reach out to somebody near you. Like he said, a table, invite someone over into your home. Look for ways to make new connections in a restaurant that you like to go to, and begin taking people on that pathway from new connection until they too become a multiplier. God bless. Have a great week. That's all we've got for this episode of the Dare to Multiply podcast. One thing that would really help both us and other new potential listeners is for you to rate this show and leave a comment in iTunes, on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you tune in to listen. Also, make sure to link up with us at dmmsfrontiermissions.com/blog on social media, and please just share this podcast with anyone you think might enjoy it. Until next time, remember, God's dreams for us are always bigger than we can imagine.